You hear it over and over in schools and colleges, on TV, and in other media. Darwinism and evolution are proven scientific facts, but the real facts suggest otherwise. During the next half hour, John Stonestreet welcomes the Discovery Institute's Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, to discuss how all life bears the unmistakable hand of God. Stay with us now for Breakpoint This Week. From the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview, this is Breakpoint This Week with John Stonestreet. It's tough for us to endure accusations that we're fantasy-based when actual observable facts indicate otherwise. But today's guest articulates the strong case for our Creator. Here's John to get things started.
Well, there is an established orthodoxy in the university, particularly in the scientific culture of the Western world, and that is an orthodoxy that ought not be questioned. And yet there are a group of very courageous individuals, thoughtful individuals who aren't questioning that orthodoxy. It really exists at almost every level, from elementary schools to graduate programs to institutions of research to the Smithsonian and everything in between. But yet there's reasons to doubt this orthodoxy. Among those men who have led the way in this is our guest today on Breakpoint This Week, and that is Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science. He now directs the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, and we'll link to that at our website, breakpoint.org. His last book, which made such an incredible splash in this entire community, was called Signature in the Cell. In fact, it was named a Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year. And now he has just released a book called Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. The Intelligent Design movement is the name for that movement, which is seeking to expose some of the holes in the secular orthodoxy. Dr. Meyer, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. I want to thank you for taking some time and kind of walk us through some of these dilemmas here on Breakpoint This Week. Dr. Meyer, I've used the phrase secular orthodoxy when it comes to science, and I think maybe some of our listeners have experienced that. I certainly work with a lot of college students who experience that orthodoxy. But you know what we're talking about kind of is that unquestioned place that neo-Darwinian naturalistic evolution has in the scientific community. Could you just kind of give us a definition of what that is, and how did it become so enshrined to the point of really being unquestioned?
The standard theory of evolution today, the textbook version of the theory, is, as you mentioned, called neo-Darwinism. It's neo in the sense that Darwin had an incomplete theory of genetics, which needed to be supplemented, and the neo-Darwinian theory traded the Darwinian idea of natural selection acting on random variations with the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations. And since Watson and Crick, we've understood that those mutations occur within the genetic material, within the DNA. So random changes in DNA are the source of new form and innovation. Natural selection sifts through the various mutations that arise, and preserving those that confer some sort of functional or survival advantage on the organism. That's the theory of how new form and function arise in the biological world. Now, that theory has larger implications. It's a scientific theory, to be sure, but it has larger worldview implications, because every worldview must answer the question, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? And a materialistic worldview or a strictly naturalistic worldview answers that question by reference to matter and energy and strictly material processes. And so the Darwinian story of how new forms of life and how the appearance of design arose is a strictly materialistic or naturalistic one, and therefore it provides an indispensable plank in this larger materialistic story, this larger materialistic narrative of how everything got here and the larger materialistic worldview. It's also become a dominant kind of thought form within the knowledge centers in the culture, in particular within universities, within science departments, biology departments, but also other fields, sociology, political science, even theology has been influenced by this Darwinian understanding of origins. And so you have Darwinian accounts of various kinds of social pathologies, some of the ideas within theology like open theism, are themselves a byproduct of this way of thinking. If there was a purely undirected, unguided process that produced everything, such that even people who are theistic affirm that, and these are some of the folks called theistic evolutionists, would affirm the Darwinian creation story, but then recognizing that the Darwinian mechanism is unguided and undirected, would then conclude that, well, therefore God doesn't know the future because the mechanism is unguided and undirected and therefore unpredictable. So the Darwinian theory of origins ends up ramifying out to affect lots of other fields. It affects our view of human nature, our understanding of jurisprudence, whether people have actual freedom or whether they're completely determined by genes, environment, and their evolutionary history, and so on. So it's the foundation for a very comprehensive materialistic view of reality. And as such, people end up encountering it in the universities, in the media, in law schools, in the courts, in lots of areas of culture. They encounter the implications of that way of thinking in all those different areas. And so it's a kind of default way of thinking in a lot of elite cultural institutions, and that's part of how it derives its power. To question that is to question the culture's overriding understanding of reality.
You know, we talk so often here on Breakpoint, have done so many stories, especially recently, about the dignity of human life itself, what gives human life dignity. And the neo-Darwinian framework, this naturalistic view of all things, leads to a naturalistic view of the human person, which robs them of their dignity as well.
There's a bioethicist, Peter Singer, at Princeton, who's an advocate of the radical animal rights agenda and the denial of any qualitative difference between humans and animals. Singer says that in these positions that he's advocating, we're just catching up with Darwin, that Darwin denied that there was any kind of fundamental or qualitative distinction between humans and animals, any distinction, as he puts it, between us and them. And it follows from that premise that to assert human rights or any distinctive form of human dignity is a form of speciesism and to be denounced as inequitable. And so his advocacy of the radical animal rights agenda, I mean, he's famous for saying that there's no important moral difference between a pig or a chicken on the one hand and a newborn baby on the other. In fact, the pig and the chicken have more utility, more value because of what they can do for humans than the newborn baby, which is just a drain on resources. So the Darwinian way of thinking ends up bleeding into ethical discussions, our understanding of human nature and dignity, and therefore our understanding of things like human rights, which is a really profoundly important concept in our whole understanding of constitutional law, jurisprudence, politics, etc.
We're talking with Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute here on Breakpoint this week. You know, one of the ways that this neo-Darwinian framework has been able to kind of keep its place as a secular orthodoxy is by dismissing any of its challenges up front as being religious in nature. In other words, the only reason not to believe this is because you have religious commitments. And we, of course, have seen that sort of secularist way of thinking in many areas of the culture, but nowhere more effective in keeping anybody out than in this secular orthodoxy of kind of the neo-Darwinian theory. And here the Discovery Institute and your organization and your work jumps in, and you're trying to do something very strategic here. And I want you to just, talk briefly. I want to get into the details of Darwin's doubt and signature of the cell, certainly, and how you're doing it. But what's this strategy jumping into the secular orthodoxy that, immediately dismisses all of its challengers as being religious?
Well, our mission is to challenge this worldview of scientific materialism. And we think it is the default worldview of the culture, certainly the elite culture. You find it pervasively expressed in the universities. Students, especially religious students who arrive at university, often feel that they miss the memo somehow, that all these smart professors and other students all seem to be thinking in a way that's profoundly at odds with the way they were raised or with perhaps the personal faith that they hold. And so you find the worldview expressed there. You find it expressed in the media. You find it expressed in the courts, the law schools, even the seminaries. And we're challenging that worldview. The idea is that the materialistic worldview derives support. It's supported by scientific discoveries. And we're saying, actually, no, if you look at the science without the filter of a pre-commitment to a naturalistic or materialistic worldview, the science looks very different. It's pointing in a very different direction towards, in particular, in biology and in physics and cosmology, it's pointing to the existence of a purposive intelligence, to a designing mind, and all the theistic faiths affirm that there is a purposive intelligence behind the natural world that is responsible for the exquisite appearance of design that we see everywhere. And so we're, in a sense, challenging scientific materialism, the worldview of scientific materialism, on scientific grounds, and challenging the premise of that worldview, which is that science actually supports the idea that matter and energy are eternal, self-existent, self-creating, and self-organizing. We argue that based on the scientific evidence and our experience of the cause and effect structure of the world, our uniform and repeated experience of how the world actually works, that worldview is actually untenable.
And it's also interesting, the critique is that, religion has held back science. Some of the repercussions that come from the scientific community against those who don't play by the rules of this scientific materialism has been nothing short of astounding.
And a number of the top scientists who are making cutting-edge discoveries and writing important books and articles in the intelligent design research community were previously at very leading institutions within the secular scientific establishment. So their expulsion or expelling, as Ben Stein put it in his film, Expelled, has been all to our advantage. It's been one of the ways that the movement has grown as folks have found that they do lack freedom in these mainstream institutions, but they've come to us wanting to contribute to the development of this research program.
Well, let me talk specifically about your contribution, because it's been vast. You've written 2 books here, The Signature of the Cell and now Darwin's Doubt, and they both kind of take on 2 areas where you see this kind of neo-Darwinian explanation for things as falling short. I mean, the first one is in this kind of revolutionary thing, of course, that Darwin had no idea about, and that is really the structure of DNA, and what the implications there on the origin of living things. So give us the punchline here. What's the summary of the argument of Signature in the Cell in a couple sentences?
Yeah, right. Well, the Signature in the Cell addressed the question of the origin of the first life, a question, as you mentioned, Darwin didn't address. And it shows that the field of evolutionary biology that addresses that question, namely chemical evolutionary theory, or what's sometimes called evolutionary abiogenesis, that theories of life from non-life, life from simpler non-living chemicals, have utterly failed to account for the crucial features of even the simplest living cells, and that this fact is actually almost universally acknowledged within evolutionary biology. No less a zealot for the materialistic evolutionary perspective than Richard Dawkins himself had to acknowledge in a fascinating interview at the end of the Ben Stein movie, Expelled, that no one knows how life arose, at least by no one he means no mainstream evolutionary biologist operating within a materialistic framework. What I do then in Signature in the Cell is show that the failure to explain the origin of the first life is critically related to the inability to account in materialistic terms for the origin of information, the biological information, the genetic information that we know is necessary to build a living cell. Since Watson and Crick in 1953, we've known that DNA contains information in a digital form. Crick explained that it was actually the 4 crucial chemical elements that convey the information, the so-called bases that run along the interior of the spine of the DNA, are actually functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. They're literally conveying instructions for building the crucial proteins and protein parts that are necessary for the cell to stay alive. What I showed in Signature was that not only do the chemical evolutionary theories on offer fail to account for this information, but in addition, we do know of a cause from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that is capable of generating digital information, and that cause is intelligence. One information theorist who was a pioneer in the application of information science to molecular biology said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. If you think about that, it's absolutely consistent with our experience. If you look at a hieroglyphic inscription or a section of computer code or a paragraph in a book or even information embedded in a radio signal and you trace it back to its ultimate source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. And so I argued in Signature in the Cell that the presence and the importance of information to the origin and maintenance of life is a powerful indicator of a prior designing intelligence. And that's the argument of the book.
We're talking with Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute here on Breakpoint this week. just to put it kind of in kind of a simple punchline sort of way, I mean, what we were saying is that when we see evidence of intelligence, our universal experience is that it comes from intelligence. Non-intelligence doesn't produce intelligence. And so the Darwinian mechanism, the neo-Darwinian mechanism is different. And this is one of the, I think, critiques that your book received wrongly, is assuming that this neo-Darwinian, process can add information and give us the world that we have. But what you're arguing is something a little bit different, isn't it? It's not just that one piece of information can be added to create the intelligence, but there's a particular order to the information. And then, of course, there's also that idea of the first cause. There has to be an intelligent first cause for it.
Yeah, there's two contexts for this discussion. The first is the context of the origin of the first life, and that question is addressed by a branch of evolutionary theory known as chemical evolution. And you're right, after the first book was published, the main attempt to critique it invoked the Darwinian mechanism of mutation and natural selection, which is a process that isn't really relevant until you have life. It doesn't become operative until you have living organisms that can produce offspring, compete with each other in a competition for survival, and at that point natural selection can become a force or a process that is relevant to how organisms change and evolve. But when we're trying to explain the origin of the first life, you can't invoke a process like natural selection that is only relevant once you have life. And so most of the critiques of the first book were just firing blanks and shooting at a target that wasn't even relevant, or they were bringing to bear a process that wasn't even relevant in their critique. At the same time, I've been long skeptical that the mutation natural selection mechanism can generate enough information to account for the fundamentally new forms of life that arise in the history of life. There are these events in the history of life, one of which I focus on in the second book called the Cambrian Explosion, in which you find dramatic innovation in biological form and structure arising very quickly or abruptly in the fossil record. And the Darwinian mechanism, for many reasons that I explain in the second book, Darwin's Doubt, lacks the creative power to account for that kind of morphological or biological innovation, and that's what I address in the second book. So in the end, I got kind of tired of conceding a point for the sake of argument that I actually doubted. People kept saying, well, Darwinian evolution can solve the problem of the origin of life. I said, no, it can't. It may be able to solve the problem of the origin of new life from simpler pre-existing life, but it certainly can't solve the problem of the origin of the first life. But in a sense, I was conceding that only for the sake of argument, and in the second book, I decided to take that on as well, because I think the neo-Darwinian mechanism really does lack the creative power that's been attributed to it. It certainly cannot account for these major innovations in the history of life. It does a pretty good job of accounting for minor modifications, finch beaks getting longer and shorter in response to changing weather conditions in the Galapagos, for example, but that kind of microevolutionary change is not what's going on in events like the Cambrian explosion.
Well, and the weakness of this neo-Darwinian explanation to the Cambrian explosion, I mean, this is something that actually Darwinists themselves have admitted, right?
Well, that's actually the big expose of the book. The book is a mystery story, and I start with the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, which was a mystery to Darwin, thus the title, Darwin's Doubt. And I trace that mystery and show what's become of it. And there are two aspects to the mystery. One is the mystery of the missing ancestral fossils, the Cambrian animals that Darwin knew about and about which we know much more today, arise in the fossil record very suddenly, very discontinuously, abruptly, in geologic terms. And that is to say that the precursors, the intermediates leading to those forms that are expected on a Darwinian picture of the history of life just are not there in the lower Precambrian strata. The other part of the mystery is the mystery of how, on any timescale, you would build these complex organisms relying on a mechanism that in turn relies on random changes in genetic information to generate new genetic information. If you think about what we know about software, and Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any that's ever been created. If you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in the section of software, are you more likely to generate a new operating system or a computer program, or are you more likely to degrade the information you have long before you ever get there? The answer to that question, based on our own experience, is obviously the latter. You're more likely to degrade the information, and the same thing turns out to be true in the biological context, and I show that. And so one of the big problems with neo-Darwinian explanation is that it, too, has an information generation problem. It can't generate the information necessary to produce these fundamentally new innovations in the history of life, and therefore it's in serious trouble. And that leads to the point of your question, which is that I'm not the only person, and that my colleagues in the ID research community aren't the only people recognizing this. In the book, I show that there are now numerous new evolutionary models that are being formulated. There are even calls by leading evolutionary biologists for a new theory of evolution, because they recognize that the mutation selection mechanism does not have the creative power long attributed to it. It can't generate the genetic information, and it also has a big problem with something new called epigenetic form and information. It turns out that a lot of what's needed to build an animal is not stored just in the genes. It's also just in the DNA. It's stored in other places in cells and in animals that are independent of genetic information, and that poses a whole additional layer of problems for the neo-Darwinian mechanism, which I also address in the book. And many of the leading evolutionary theorists who are critical of neo-Darwinism are critical because they doubt the theory can account for this higher level of form and information that's required to build new animals. So it is actually very much a new day. I think it's fair to say neo-Darwinism is actually dead, despite the way in which students encounter it as a textbook orthodoxy, despite the public spokesman for the theory in the form of people like Richard Dawkins or the National Center for Science Education or reporters at the New York Times. And this is one of the themes of the book, is there's a huge disparity between the public presentation of the theory and its actual status in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
We often hear the intelligent design movement is summarized, well, it's the argument from design. But it's not just that there's a design, there's an irreducibly complex design. Could you kind of talk us through what that means?
This is the concept that Michael Behe developed, noting that there were many molecular machines inside living cells, circuitry, that depended on the interaction, the functionally integrated interaction of many separate protein parts. The system that he made famous was this bacterial flagellar motor with its 30 different protein parts forming parts that are clearly identifiable as U-joints and bushings and drive shafts and rotors and stators. This is an extraordinary and exquisite level of mechanical engineering that's at work in the nanotechnology inside living cells. I'd like to say it's high-tech evidenced in low life. So even the bacterium, a lowly bacterium, has one of these exquisite rotary engines. And Behe noted that the research has shown that if you remove even one of these parts of these machines, they very oftentimes lose function altogether. And so it makes it very hard to account for the origin of these systems in the standard gradual neo-Darwinian way, where each additional mutation or part that's generated would confer some survival advantage, because we know that the 29-part, the 28-part, the 27-part, 26-part version of the flagellar motor plays no function at all. It would be made inoperative by the loss of those parts, and so there's nothing there. Natural selection selects for functional advantage, but many of the intermediate steps from any conceivably simpler system to the full-blown flagellar motor, we know experimentally lack any function at all, much less a functionally advantageous state that could be selected by natural selection. So it's a big problem. In the book that I've just finished, in Darwin's Doubt, I show a variation of this problem in relation to the circuitry that scientists have discovered is necessary to build new animals. If you want to build a new animal, the evolutionary process is going to build a new animal. It's got to alter circuitry that is involved in making sure that the right cells are turned on at the right time and the different types of cells differentiate themselves from each other in the right way at the right time. There's a complex choreographed process under the control of things called developmental gene regulatory networks that are actually forms of integrated circuitry. And what the developmental biologists have discovered is that if you alter that circuitry, catastrophic effects ensue for the organism. It dies. And that raises a big problem. If you want to build an animal, you've got to have this circuitry controlling the way cells organize themselves and are differentiated from each other. But you can't change the circuitry without destroying the animal. So how would you ever evolve one type of animal body plan into another when doing so requires new circuitry arising from old circuitry, when we know that you can't make that kind of transition without destroying the developing animal at all and thus shutting down the evolutionary process. So that's a variation on the Behe irreducible complexity theme, and one which is very much understood to be a problem within mainstream developmental biology.
Well, we're just thankful for organizations like the Discovery Institute and scientists like Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's been my guest today on Breakpoint this week. Dr. Meyer's 2 books, Signature in the Cell, and now just most recently, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. We'll link you to those at our website, breakpoint.org. You can also visit the Discovery Institute at discovery.org. And thank you for joining us on Breakpoint this week.